So you want to be strong enough to be able to say no to yourself even of good things, and that way you can say no to yourself for bad things too. You want your mind to control your body, not the other way around.
And the reason that we do it for the 40 days is because Lent is the mark of when Jesus went into the desert.
Right.
Which have off on Sundays.
My kids really like that rule. Yeah, they give up chocolate except Sundays. They're like, Sunday, woo! You know?
Oh, I never knew that. I never knew that you did.
Yeah. Some people go hardcore and don't, but it's not 40 days if you don't take out the Sundays. It's longer than 40 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's yep.
Besides, you don't have that very often.
Yeah, I typically don't do what I'm doing on my day, on my feast day, on my Sabbath day.
Listen, if you're gonna have.
But it's actually a really good tie-in with this, since we're talking about keeping the Sabbath.
There you go.
It's a good place to start. It's a good place to start. We're talking about keeping the Sabbath day holy. So what did you guys, since I wasn't here at the end last week because I had to go lead songs, what did you guys end with, talking with Michael, or where are you at? I know we're talking about the Sabbath day and keeping it holy.
We didn't really get deep into the third commandment.
Okay.
Not in the sense of we didn't do any of the reading, so we're still in the first part here.
Okay.
It was more, Deacon just continued to really get deep into what it meant to honor the Sabbath.
Sure.
So.
Okay. So.
And how we really aren't doing what we should be doing.
We are or aren't?
We are not.
Okay.
Yeah. Because he said, everybody thinks it's a day of rest. It's not a day of rest. It's a day for God.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to keep it holy in that way. And the old adage was, it's a day of rest. The seventh day you rest. And I know I have a bad habit of that.
Well, it's not resting in the sense of like expending no effort. It's resting from the normal stuff you do the other 6 days. So you have room for other stuff, right? I mean, we're busy, right? That would have been even more true of the ancient people because they were living hand to mouth,
Right.
with barely enough calories to get by on. So they were always giving their energy to trying to get a hold of food or whatever. So yeah, it's that setting aside time. Now, you heard me mention, or will hear me mention in the sermon about the 7 festival days in the Jewish calendar. The weekly festival is Shabbat, is Sabbath. And so it counts as a feast day. So you have a feast day once a week, and that festival is for the purpose of remembering that God's, of course it's 7th day because on the 7th day of creation God sits down, right? And that's that language of rest. And we lose that piece, is that the picture that would have been very, very evident to an ancient person that's not evident to us as modern people, because Genesis chapter 1, that sitting down language happens in the first Genesis creation story, right? The 7th day God rested from all his labors. But he's sitting down on a throne. He's sitting down to reign. He's created his kingdom. Now he's reigning over it. He's not resting in the sense of like, well, I'm done. He's done with that work, the creating work of the kingdom. Now he's going to reign over it. It's a different kind of thing he's doing. So we reenact that. And there is rest from our normal sort of workaday stuff where we're scrambling around trying to make a living so that we can focus our energy and our attention on God himself and on his people, the people around us who are made in his image. So it's perfectly appropriate. The old traditions like my grandmother had of Sunday dinner at so-and-so's house, right? You're attending to these relationships that get a little atrophied because I'm busy working and you're busy working and whatever, right? And you attend to these relationships on that day. Now, where the Pharisees got off base was they started trying to quantify what is work, right? This many steps counts as work and this many steps doesn't. Lighting your pilot lighting your stove counts as work, but cooking your meal doesn't. They got focused on not doing what we're doing out there as opposed to what the focus was, the positive focus. which is to be able to focus our energy and our attention on God. And this is where Luther goes with it. So just to read the intro of Luther's explanation in the Large Catechism, because I think he gets pretty controversial pretty quick, so it's worth looking at it. It says, our word holy day or holiday is so called from the Hebrew words Sabbath, which properly means to rest, that is, deceased from labor. Thus, our common expression for stopping work literally means observing a holy day or holiday. In the Old Testament, God set apart the seventh day and appointed it for rest, and he commanded it to be kept holy above all other days. As far as outward observance is concerned, the commandment was given to the Jews alone. They were to abstain from hard work and to rest, so that both man and beast might be refreshed and not be exhausted by constant labor. In time, however, the Jews interpreted this commandment too narrowly and grossly misused it. They slandered Christ and would not permit him to do what they themselves were in the habit of doing on that day, as we read in the gospel, as if the commandment could be fulfilled by refraining from manual labor of any kind. This was not its intention, but as we shall hear, it meant that we should sanctify the holy day or day of rest. So, do you know what he's referring to here? What story in the Gospels? It's when he heals people on the Sabbath, right? And they get on his case for healing people. And he says, well, if your donkey falls in a hole, you're going to rescue it on the Sabbath day. I'm rescuing this person. How is that not legit? The point is not an outward observance of it, although that is helpful. And of course, in the case of ethnic Israel, was required. It's part of their rhythm of life. For us, as Christians, we have just the tiniest little bit of cultural memory because Hobby Lobby's still not open on Sundays.
Or Chick-fil-A.
Or Chick-fil-A, right. As Tim Hawkins eloquently soliloquized for us. Yeah, if you haven't heard the Chick-fil-A song, you need to hear it. It's one of the funniest songs I've ever heard in my life. Maybe we'll play that at the end. The point is that it's being set aside for this other purpose. It's not freedom from, it's freedom for. And that is a way of thinking that's very, very absent from modernity because we live on this side of the French and American revolutions. And we always think of freedom from. When I was a kid, we learned Schoolhouse Rock, No More Kings. There's a little song you sing, right? No More Kings is freedom from the king. But the concept of freedom that not just Christians and Jews possessed, but most ancient people. This is true in Confucianism. It's true in Stoicism from the Roman world, Greek world / Roman world. Their idea of freedom was it was freedom to become what you were made to be in the first place without all the hindrances. The reason why you do the things you do is to let go of this stuff that's keeping you from being, not anything you want to be, but the thing you were made to be, the thing you were given to be. In a fullest sense, that's, to be a human, right? One interpretation of sin is that it makes us less human than we should be. Okay? That's not a modern interpretation. It sounds kind of like psychobabble. This literally goes back to the first systematic theologian of the church after Paul, and his name was Irenaeus. His most famous line is, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." Because our sin is always keeping us from being fully alive. Jesus is really the first person we see living the way a human being should live. Perfectly aligned with God's will, but because of that, perfectly free as to everyone else's will. No one was able to make Jesus do what he didn't want to do. He lived a perfectly free life. Not free from being the Son of God, that's what he was made to be. But free from all the other expectations. I mean, have you all had this experience, right? I really wanted to say this to them, but I couldn't quite get it to come out of my mouth, or I thought it would hurt their feelings, or whatever. Jesus doesn't seem to be constrained by any of that. He'll tell the woman at the well, "No, you don't have a husband because you had 7.
Told his own mother.
Told, "Mom, what does this have to do with me?" Right? Who are my brothers and my mother and my sister? The people who listen, the people who do God's will. But equally, When they said, stone this woman caught in adultery, he's like, nope. Tell you what, if you haven't sinned, you throw the first stone. I'll join right in. Right? Didn't matter whether the pressure was coming from the left or from the right. It didn't matter whether the pressures were coming from societal expectations or the king or the Roman procurator, and Pilate, right? Didn't matter who the expectations were coming from. Jesus' needle pointed straight north, and he charted his own course. We don't live that way. But it's the way we were made to live. It's what God created us to be and to do, the way we want to created us to live that way. So his goal is to set us free. So I was explaining to Samantha before we began, of course, why we fast, right? It really is not about dieting. It's about, if you're not giving up something you don't want to give up, you won't get the experience of fasting. Fasting is saying, I can say no to this perfectly good thing, so I can surely say no to a bad thing. It's learning to control your appetites so your appetites don't control you. It's a spiritual discipline. It's not salvific. It doesn't save you, but it lets you start to live like the kind of person you were saved to be. Actually, the person you were created to be, and then had to be rescued when you ended up being less than that. And that's the purpose of it. Sabbath keeping is the same way. The discipline of doing the less than productive thing. Marva Dawn, who was a wonderful, wonderful Lutheran theologian, passed away a few years ago. She taught us so much, and I had the privilege of meeting her when I was in seminary. In fact, I had the privilege of bringing her to campus because she had a lot of that freedom. A lot of that freedom she had really lived into her identity in Christ. And she would look the dean of the school in the eye and tell them they were full of garbage. And she did. Wasn't the dean at that point. By the time she got there, it was a new dean, but it was one of the systematic theology professors. Just told her, you are completely off base. And also could say the same thing to people who would pull her the other direction. She experienced that through her spiritual discipline. By the time I met her, and she had a book called Keeping the Sabbath Holy, WHOLLY, Keeping It Fully. She'd written a wonderful book about this. She'd done some other reflections on similar things. She had been a triathlete in her youth. By the time I had her to campus, she and her husband, she got married quite late in life, in her 40s. She and her husband celebrated their anniversary in months because her life expectancy was so low. The only thing keeping her alive was her discipline and the Lord. She could barely walk. She had all kind of it wasn't multiple system atrophy, but it's along that line. It's this autoimmune diseases that attack a bunch of things and make everything fall apart. She had to have a highly specialized diet. But she, when we picked her up at the airport, because she was a guest speaker on campus, she was to be preaching 2 services. She found out in the car on the way, I gave her the bulletin I was literally picking her up at Washington Dulles Airport, driving her up to Gettysburg. She had to get out of the car and preach. She preaches from a memorized text, not her sermon, the gospel. She recites the sermon, she recites the text of the scripture from memory. And so she found out they gave her the wrong preaching text. And she said, she said, I would love to talk to you. I need you to drive in silence because I need to memorize this thing. And when we arrived, she read the sermon from memory and then preached her sermon from memory. Incredible woman. But even though her body was falling apart, she had less external freedom than she had at another time in her life. She had more true freedom because she was becoming who she was meant to be. And just a true inspiration to me, as you can tell from the ways I tell her story about this. But she was dedicated to keeping the Sabbath. It was a huge part of her spiritual discipline. And she was a writer. So if you've ever had to do serious writing, you don't know when the good idea will come. And it's a real temptation. I'll do some jotting down. In order to keep her Sabbath, on her piano, they had a little basket with 3x5 cards. If she had an idea on the Sabbath, she wrote a quick note, threw it in, kept her Sabbath, kept going. And then could only develop them and write them on them Monday through Saturday in her case. Now this is going to bring us to the next section here. We haven't prayed yet, though. I wanted to wait till everyone was kind of gathered, but we started talking. So let's pray now. Lord, as we reflect together on the wisdom that is inherent in your word, wisdom for our lives, perfectly aligned with who you have created us to be and have redeemed us to be, help us to glean that wisdom and figure out how to apply it into our lives. Bless us and keep us so that filled with your grace, we may know the goodness of your love and we may align our lives with your will. Because your will is not only perfect, but it is where we will experience the most joy and freedom. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want to get to the controversial stuff and like to see what you think. Luther continues. Therefore, according to its literal outward sense, this commandment does not concern us as Christians. It is an entirely external matter, like other ordinances of the Old Testament, connected with particular customs, persons, times, and places, from all of which we are now set free through Christ. So what do you think? Before we go on, do you agree with Luther? I mean, remember, this is Luther. He's not Scripture. You're allowed to disagree with him.
I mean, he's not wrong, just in the sense of, he's not saying to not keep the Sabbath holy by any means, and he's not saying to, he's not saying to break the third commandment. He's just saying the ways that it was taught in the Old Testament are no longer would apply.
He specifically puts it into the realm of custom, right? And Christians have long made a distinction between the moral commandments of Scripture and what we would call the cultic commandments of Scripture. Cultic meaning not a cult like you know, the people who thought the meteor was going to bring the end of time or something, I don't know, a couple of years ago. Branch Davidians, all those people, not like that, not like Jim Jones kind of cult. Cultic simply means rituals, like the word culture, right? As a culture, we have rituals. We engaged in one a couple of weeks ago, Super Bowl, right? Big cultural ritual. Christians have long made that distinction, so that, and that goes all the way back to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 15, what's called the First Ecumenical Council, right, or the First Apostolic Council. They get together. Do Gentiles have to get circumcised before they can become Christians? That's the question on the table. And they have a big debate, they have a big discussion, they decide, nope, they don't. They have to abstain from drinking blood. That almost sounds like a cultural ritual. But it turns out it's for the sake of not offending the Jewish members of the church, right? You don't want to throw a stumbling block in somebody else's way. And they're to abstain from sexual immorality. And that's where it comes down to that distinction of what's immoral we're not allowed to do. But what was simply a way of Israel distinguishing itself from its neighbors because it had different practices, that stuff we are free from. That stuff doesn't continue. If you like shrimp, give thanks, because Jews can't eat them. So just went for a seafood dinner on Thursday, so that's why I was thinking of that.
Why shrimp have scales? Shrimp have scales.
Uh,
Bottom feeders.
Yeah.
Because it's a bottom feeder?
Jews are not allowed to eat insects, and they look like insects.
Oh.
In fact, my wife calls them sea insects. My wife will not eat
Yeah, I
them.
know. They can't eat eels or anything like that because they don't have scales, too.
Yeah, I forget what all the requirements are. They're not, of course, that's why they're not allowed to eat pigs. There's a whole bunch of things that are there that are embedded in. When Christians fast, if you have any friends who are Orthodox, go buy them a cheeseburger now, because they won't be able to eat it during Lent. The Orthodox all give up the same thing for you don't get a choice. They all do it together. It's a community aspect. So you give up meat, and in their case, that means anything with a backbone. So the one thing I never did was offer my friend Father John shrimp immediately after Lent was over, because he'd had his fill. Because it didn't count as meat because it didn't have a backbone. They also didn't offer him anything made with lentils, because they get tired of eating beans. So what else do they give up? Cheese, and they give up oil and alcohol. So they've given up a lot for that. By the time they get to Easter, they're ready to eat all that stuff. Christians do continue to fast, but we don't have as structured rules. Early Christians fasted on every Wednesday and Friday through most of the year, except during the season of Easter. They would fast from meat, from sunup to sundown, kind of thing. And cream, I believe in cream. So twice a week you would not eat meat. But it was a discipline. It's a fasting discipline, so you don't get out of the habit of fasting. So instead of it coming around once a year for 40 days, most of the year, 2 days a week, you're fasting from something. This is still kept by a lot of Christians around the world, especially in the two-thirds world. They don't have as much access to meat, so it's not as much of a cultural habit for them. In fact, a guy was doing a documentary probably 20 years ago now in Ethiopia, back when, Ethiopia used to be the poster child for like starving people in poor areas. Maybe 30 years ago now. He was doing this documentary, and it was this whole big thing, and the whole village was going to share one chicken. As he's living with them, of course, he's there with his Western crew, and they're eating the local food and that kind of stuff. And they're waiting. There's this big expectation of this. They don't have any chickens. Someone has to make like a 2-day journey to go get and buy the chicken and bring it back to this little village. And they arrived back on a Friday. So they have the chicken, but they're not going to eat it because it's a fast day. At this point, the documentary guy says, I give them credit for being the kind of people they are, but I'm out. Like, he just left. He's like, we can't live this way for the next 3 months and live with these people. Here's what's funny. They had all kind of money. They could get whatever they wanted. The local people had more freedom than his crew coming in from Europe had, because their lives weren't dictated by their appetites. They could say no to themselves in a way that he wasn't accustomed to doing coming from the UK. And I lift all this up because we're going to go a little further with Luther. Is it a ritual like that? Because and Christians have celebrated it not as a cultural thing for a long time, because as you probably know, Sabbath is Saturday, not Sunday. So when we think of the fact that Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A continue to be closed on Sunday, but it used to be that almost everyone was, right? That was not Shabbat anyway. Shabbat was Saturday. So we keep a practice of Sabbath keeping, but now we feel free to reassign it. Why do we reassign it to the day of Sunday? Well, because it's the day of the resurrection. It's not the day that was appointed as the Sabbath, because it's really, and this is why your calendars run from Sunday to Saturday instead of from Monday to Sunday. If it was organized like the book of Genesis, it would run from Monday to Sunday. Because our calendars were produced in a Christian atmosphere, they run from Sunday to Saturday, because the new first day is the day Jesus rose. That's day one of the new creation. Now, of course, what's interesting, I've seen a couple of calendars now no longer print that way, as people are pushing back against the history of Christianity in the West. Now you'll get some that run Monday to Sunday or Saturday to Friday. They lump the weekend together instead of splitting it in half. So, but the purpose there is, well, let's talk about why would we? I've given let the cat out of the bag with why we celebrate the Sabbath on a Sunday rather than a Saturday, because of Jesus' rising from the dead. But why would we feel free to do that? And why would we still do it as a community? Because if we're free to do whatever we want, why don't I'll take mine on Friday, you take yours, whenever. Pastors can't take Sunday as a day off, good gracious. This is partly why Marva Dawn wrote her book all those years ago, is because it was written for pastors like, so when do you take your Sabbath? Because this applies to you too. Why do you think we do it as a community? I mean, I don't know, no one's told me the answer. I have my ideas. I'm interested in your ideas.
Partly in the thought of still looking at Saturday as the day of rest, in the sense of, okay, so day 1 is when Jesus rose, day 7 is when God sat,
Christians saw the Jewish people not do anything on Saturday, so they said, we'll work on Saturday and sell stuff and buy stuff and do whatever. And then Sunday we won't,
There's probably some truth to that.
you know. Just
I mean, that's
just
why
a
Christians,
commerce way.
I mentioned that Christians fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays. It's because Jews fasted on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's why. So there was some of that, probably like distinguishing ourselves, like our group does this, your group does that, right? There's probably some of that. And just practical, hey, you can make money and I can't make money on that
Yeah.
day, we're trading off whose shop is open when, right? There's a big camera store in New York City, real famous for this. They're run by Hasidic Jews. Huh?
Yeah, I've seen it, I know.
BNC. Even their website is shut down. Nothing is working.
Guy I coached basketball with, he was Jewish. He claimed to be a different kind of Jewish, which I didn't understand all that. But anyhow, his daughter was not allowed to play on Friday night or Saturday until sundown, and he would not help coach Friday night or Saturday until sundown. However, what I didn't grasp was they got together and they didn't own a building. They met wherever they could. There was the YMCA left them and some other buildings
Sure.
or whatever. But they got together and played basketball Saturday afternoon. You can't coach it or your daughter play it, but they can there. They never understood it.
Uh-huh.
He also explained to me about the kosher, the Hasidic Jews or whatever, how they're not allowed to change toilet paper on a Sunday. And I said, well, if you really want to go that far, then they're not allowed to take a crap on a Sunday because that's work. He didn't like that answer. To me, if you're going to be that stupid about changing toilet paper, then
Well, yeah, and that's of course what we as Christians are going to look at the Pharisees parsing it out to
Yeah,
how many
what-
steps you're
what
allowed
was
to
and what
take and
wasn't,
what counts
yeah.
as work and what doesn't, right, yeah.
but he carried.
I wouldn't count changing the toilet paper roll as work because doesn't seem like work to me.
Flipping the light switch.
Flipping the white switch or whatever, yeah, that doesn't seem like one of those things.
And Michael always talks about that people that up in the Poconos, that the kids would ask the roofer to turn the light switch on because they weren't allowed to turn the light
Right.
switch on. It's like,
Here's the flip side of it. When we keep those kind of disciplines, and I think I shared this story before, I apologize if I did, but like when I was studying the Coptic Orthodox and their 16-year-old daughter, of course, when she's fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays from milk, she can't go for ice cream with her softball team after the game. She goes with them, but she can't order ice cream. She has to order French fries or something. And I said, how do you feel about that? And she said, on the one hand, I hate it. I was seeing from Sam this morning. I don't want to go have Lent. On the other hand, she says, it reminds me that I'm different when I could forget that. I'm supposed to be different. I'm supposed to be following. It reminds me of Jesus. And I'm like, okay, I can see both sides of it now. And I sort of wonder if that's part of the reason why everyone agreed of one common consent to keep the Sabbath. I work out way more consistently if I'm meeting somebody at the gym. I can tell myself I'll work out at home, and then I could, oh, this is really cool. I can't stop watching this. You know? Whereas if I know someone's going to meet me, and okay, I gotta go. You know, or I'm pretty good at like doing karate with my son, but it's easier to do 50 reps instead of 100 or 150 or whatever we should be doing. It's always easier to take that line to things when you're not meeting people. And I think sometimes our modern sense of individualism, we make our lives way harder than they need to be. Like if I was getting the help of my neighbors to keep my resolutions, I mean, that's a great thing. If you want to keep your, if you want to statistically improve your ability to keep your New Year's resolution, tell as many people as possible about it. I'm not joking. That's actually, and I say, ask me in a week if I'm still doing it. You almost always will keep it then.
I mean, the Jews took it to the extreme, even with growing their crops. They were only allowed to grow the crops for 6 years, and then they had to not grow the 7th year. And there was supposedly enough harvest in the 6th year that would take them to the 9th year. It was
Right.
and what they planted in the 8th year, they weren't allowed to eat yet.
right.
I was in, I think, today's reading or yesterday.
They also weren't allowed to harvest the edges of the fields.
So poor people could come and take what they needed, right? Yep, the gleanings, yep. They weren't allowed to be exhaustive in there. And all of that involves trust that God will provide enough, and I don't need to hoard, right? And that, of course, all goes back to in the wilderness, when they're being provided with the manna, they're not allowed to collect manna on the Sabbath day. They have to they collect a double amount. If any other day except Saturday, Friday, any other day that they would collect, if they took too much, it would go bad. No song today. I had to substitute teach. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks. Michael, I had to substitute teach. Actually, I have to do the whole class. In the wilderness, when they're wandering, if they took enough for 2 days, it would go bad, except on Fridays. Then they could have enough to eat the next day, and it would carry over. So it's this sort of, if you do what God commands you to do, He'll provide. It's that trust level. And if you try to be a superhero and do what God tells you not to do, it doesn't do any good. It's the blessing of God that makes it what it is, not your effort. Which is why fasting and almsgiving, none of it is meritorious. None of it helps us get saved. It's an expression of what we do because we've been given this great gift of salvation.
You know, I have a problem with that fasting for Lent. My niece, she always, we're giving up this for Lent. And then I sit there and I think about, is that like the Pharisees and Sadducees standing on the street corner saying, look at me, look at what I just did?
Yeah, she doesn't need to tell anybody.
Yeah, well, you just said you should tell more people, so you're good.
Oh, no, I said for your New Year's resolutions,
But I
yeah.
mean, even that, and you tell everybody, oh, I'm doing without chocolate. Oh, I can't stand it.
I think you're absolutely right.
It's written there. Don't do that.
Yeah, yep. If you
Keep
go
your
dramatic
hair
with
combed and all that stuff. It
Oh,
says
yeah.
when you're fasting, don't look like a poor beggar, and it's like, and so many people get into that. I mean, I know I did. I did. I mean, Easter Sunday, we would leave here, and I would make sure I go get a donut because I didn't have a donut for 40 days.
it. There you go.
You know, and it's like, yeah, I tend not to give up stuff anymore for that reason.
Interesting. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, we used to teach the kids in Sunday school that rather than, it's hard for them to understand that concept of sacrifice, and they wind up doing just that. But we used to teach them that they could add something of value to their life, like an act of kindness each day, rather than give something up for Lent. And it seemed to help them to understand the concept of sacrificing something of yourself. So,
And I think that's probably wise in the way that, we're not all ready to get everything at the beginning, right? I mean, in our spiritual life, kids, because they don't even possess certain mental faculties to grapple with this stuff, right? So you start by being, can you do one nice thing a day for somebody you wouldn't do otherwise? And if they're serious about it, if the kids and you don't expect a 5-year-old to be serious about it the way a 9-year-old has the capacity to. Then you introduce, that's why in traditions that do confession where you have to go to the priest, they don't do that with young kids. There's an age you go for your first confession. Because they figure that the kids aren't ready yet, and they're right. So you could add fasting in terms of like giving something up at a certain stage when the kids can understand what the purpose of this is, and you don't expect them to go full force. I mentioned all the stuff that the Orthodox gave up. My spiritual director, my friend for years, used to say, he said he would get these converts and they were so zealous, they just came into the tradition. I'm going to do everything the first year. He's like, no, you're not. You're going to fail. And what's going to happen is you're going to get discouraged. Do one thing. You're trying to build a spiritual muscle. You don't start by saying, I'm going to bench press 500 pounds. No, you're not. You're going to start by doing 5-pound weights like at a physical therapist's office, and you're going to build up to it, And that I think has some wisdom in it. It's funny, the things I used to hate doing when I first became a Christian are now things I look forward to doing in the sense that they remind me of who I am. They're part of my identity now. And I do think they build a capacity little by little that I didn't used to possess, to say no when I need to say no and say yes when I need to say yes, especially to myself. Yeah.
That reminds me, I always say I listen to that little, I usually, not always, listen to that little voice in my head. And I believe it's God talking to me like, stupid, don't say that. You're just gonna embarrass somebody or yourself or whatever, because I'm always saying stuff. And then you were talking earlier, yeah, Jesus didn't have that little voice in his head because he is that voice in my head.
Oh, yeah.
Like, yeah, go ahead, do that. No, don't do that.
That's a good,
Yeah.
I love that. That's awesome, Paul. Yeah, and Lisa and I are, the longer we walk as Christians, we've been taking on more robust fasting during Lent. And trying to do the same one, so we're helping each other, So.
Yeah.
And not because we're trying to be spiritual superheroes per se, but we do want to build our strength. And you don't build your strength by continuing to do exactly what you used to do. You want to kind of grow. Now, conversely, and you mentioned the sort of bragging and that sort of doing the Pharisee thing. An interesting reality too, people who, again, Christians who have a living fasting tradition where it's much more part of the way they do things day to day as a community. The bonds of hospitality overwhelm your commitment to fasting. So, if you're fasting from meat, Megan, and I don't know that, and you come to my house and I serve you a burger, you don't say, oh no, I'm fasting. You say, thank you, and you eat it.
Oh,
It's more important, again, this is a spiritual discipline. It's more important that I make her feel valued for the goal, so the gift that my friend, if they're giving me food, I want them to feel appreciated for what they gave me, rather than me keeping it's more important that their spiritual life be intact than mine. So now, conversely, this is again why you do it as a community. You're not supposed to for the next 40 days, I'm giving up, I'm giving up steak. Make sure you serve me some steak when I come over to visit, You can't clue them in like that either. It's just when the genuine conflict happens, It's not a way of getting around the cheating. And like I said, in the Western Church, we have your Sabbath day is your day off anyway. So whatever you're giving off, you can eat your donuts.
yeah, I never did.
There you go.
And I knew that concept of you don't count Sundays, but to me it was just from Lent till Easter.
Yep. I think either way is fine. Again, it's a spiritual discipline. It's whatever discipline you commit yourself to. But it sometimes helps to have a conversation with somebody about it. And this all ties back into the Sabbath keeping, that if you're not going to take Sunday as your Sabbath, there's a reason you can't, right? Again, we're supposed to, and Luther's going to get into this and a little bit further down into this. He's going to talk about how, he says, I say it's not restricted to a particular time as it was among the Jews, when it had to be precisely this or that day, for in itself no one day is better than any other. Actually, there should be worship daily. However, since this is more than the common people can do, at least one day in the week must be set apart for it. Now, again, in the modern world, especially when it comes to I hate that high school sports happens on Sunday mornings now, right? That's a real problem.
Any sport, really.
Any sport, yeah, or whatever, right? But if your kid is involved in something and you feel like you want to honor their commitment to the team, they really need to do this thing, or really do this thing. I like what you did with Samantha, she was allowed to play championship games, but not the other ones, right? I thought that was great because you're teaching her some discernment in that, right? But that's one of the other reasons whenever I've started a new worship service around here, it's always been in midweek. So you could come to Tuesday at lunchtime, or you could come to Wednesday at dinner time, or 7 p.m., or whatever works, when it works, when it works. There's other options. That's not the only one. Of course, now you can stream it too, worship from home. But you don't get Eucharist that way.
I often wonder why the Christians didn't make it from Saturday night to Sunday night. So that,
it's a good question. I'm guessing, and it is a guess. I'll try to do a little research and see if we have documents to tell us. A lot of times, you have is different. Remember, Christianity is not a united whole. There's no communications to do that in the ancient world. That's what I loved about the Da Vinci Code. There's this big conspiracy. If there was a big conspiracy, we were the worst conspirators ever, because we were so busy fighting with each other. How does that conspiracy work if you're busy fighting with your co-conspirators? But No, because that's a lot. There were all these big debates. One of the other things that happened at the Council of Nicaea, in addition to us getting the Nicene Creed, which happened first, that took like 3.5 weeks out of a year, was a debate on when do you celebrate Easter? Because they were celebrating it in two different ways. They were dating Easter two different ways in two different parts of the empire. Does it matter? I don't know.
Well, the Orthodox started like almost an hour before.
Well, and
Greek
the,
Orthodox, I mean,
right, well, and of course there's Old Calendar Orthodox who are off by 12 days from the New Calendar Orthodox, and all that stuff. So and the Orthodox only occasionally celebrate Easter on the same Sunday as Western Christians do. So there's all these different calculations that could go in, and you could go with any of them. How do you settle it? Well, sometimes one option just kind of, by popular demand, everyone starts adopting it. That happens several times throughout church history. I'm guessing, though, that I don't know why it goes from midnight to midnight. I don't know why that temporal change happened instead of sunset to sunset. More consistency, right? Maybe because sunset changes every day.
right.
Maybe that was part of it. I do know why Christians started celebrating at sunrise, though, because, of course, that's when the resurrection appearances happen. That's when Mary Magdalene discovers that the tomb's empty, and Peter and John, and all that stuff happens on Sunday morning. So what we see in the earliest part of the church is Christians are gathering for Shabbat, especially Jewish Christians are gathering for Shabbat on Saturday, and then they're getting up on Sunday morning and worshiping up. In fact, and we have this from non-Christian sources. We have Roman sources. Christians gather on hills all around the city, and they face east, and they sing to Christ as though to God. They were confused by this. But yeah, that's what we were doing because that's when the resurrection happened. And that's actually why almost all traditional churches, the wall with the altar is east, because you're facing the rising sun. And it's not that Christians thought the rising sun was Christ. The rising of the sun reminded them of the resurrection of Jesus. And that's why very few people left who remember when the altars were pushed against the wall, because they get pulled out in 1963. So most people, even if they were alive, don't have a memory of like the pastor standing with his back to the congregation leading the worship service, which is what you would do. Eucharist was done all of us facing the same direction because we were all facing east.
I don't remember that because I'm thinking about it, because at that time we would have went out here to Salem. Salem's not set up that way.
Yeah.
They had pulpits, so they weren't up against,
Right, but the altar, not the pulpits,
yeah,
the altar.
now you're making me trying to think.
Might even still be. I know that when I went to the UCC, was it Littlemore?
Littlemore is out.
Their altar's still against the wall.
Oh, is it?
It's never pulled out.
I was never in that.
Yeah. Every Protestant in the world pulled their altar out from the wall because the Catholics did it. I'm not joking. It was the Catholics who did it first in Vatican II. Every altar got pulled out because Catholics can do that. They can say, do this, and it has to be done.
Oh, yeah.
There's no dispute. There's no local options. They just did it. And the Protestants went, that's pretty cool. Let's do that. Because then the pastor can face the congregation. And there's theology around it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it like it was just a fun thing to do. The theology being that God's in the middle of the community now, instead of we're all facing God together. So there's strengths and weaknesses to both. I had to learn to lead worship at an east wall altar. My first church as a vicar, I was a learning pastor for 2 years. They had an east wall altar. And the reason you do is that the pastor is no better than the rest of you, and he faces the same direction as everyone else. The flip side of it is that if we turn around and the pastor's facing you, then God is in the midst of the community. So there's two different ways of looking at it, and I can go either way. The reason why that wasn't a problem for Roman Catholics to move the wall, oh gosh, we're way past time. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
The reason why the Catholics pulled the altars out, and that's why it's not a problem for them, is that the theology Catholics have of the priest is that the priest is in persona Christi. He's literally in the person of Christ to you. So that's why you can confess your sins to him and he can say you're forgiven. As a Lutheran pastor, I don't forgive you. I reassure you of the forgiveness of Christ. I pronounce Christ's forgiveness. Roman Catholic priests can say, you're not forgiven. And he's speaking for Jesus. So that's why they can stand on the other side of the altar and face you, because you're still facing God as far as they're thinking. So there's different ways of understanding why we do what we do. And it was interesting, a couple of years ago, a really famous Orthodox theologian, Tom Hopko, was asked what theoretically stands between reunification between the Orthodox churches and the Roman Church. And he went through, and he pretty much said the only thing that is a theoretical break, he said there's tons of practical reasons why you can never go back. But he said there's the only really theoretical one that I remember him from the article was he said they need to go back to what's called ad orientem, meaning facing east. The priest is no better than anyone else, and the priest does not stand in the person of Christ. They need to give that up. Both of which, at least not so much they have to face east, but the priest is not the person of Christ. Protestants would 100% agree with. I do not represent Christ to you. And for that I'm grateful. So, to wrap us up, because we are over time, in her book about keeping the Sabbath holy, what Marva Dawn recommends is pick a day and keep a Sabbath. Keep it regularly. Make that your Sabbath day. And then share that Sabbath day with other people around you so you can all do it together. So you can keep that community element for it. It may be that for your family, Sabbath is a Friday because Dad's work schedule is Sunday through Thursday or whatever. I don't know. But whatever it is for you guys at a time in your life, keep practicing Sabbath because it's good for you. It's beneficial for you. It's going to help you in every possible way to rest from all your normal stuff so you can focus on God better. And that's going to only be a benefit to your spiritual life. Anybody have anything they'd like to add at this point? I know we're over time. Okay.